Base 73, a top-secret facility in the Nevada desert, February 16, 2024. My eyes were glued to the laptop screen when the email arrived. The sender was anonymous, with no identifying information, but the subject line sent a chill down my spine. Base 73, the truth you need to see. Having worked as an investigative reporter for over a decade, I'd crossed paths with conspiracy theories, uncovered government secrets, and exposed scandals. But the name Base 73 carried a shadowy aura, unlike any other. It wasn't just an urban legend, it was something few dared to mention. With hesitation, I clicked on the email. The content was brief, but cryptic. You've been chosen to uncover the truth. Your credential will be waiting at the address below. Come alone. The address at the end pointed to an abandoned warehouse in the middle of the Nevada desert. I frowned. A trap? Maybe. A false lead? Probably. But the name Base 73 echoed in my mind. In all my research, it always appeared shrouded in rumors of clandestine experiments, things that surpassed the most grotesque science fiction. Human hybrids, genetically altered creatures, nightmares forcibly created in the depths of government secrecy. I should have ignored it, but that damned curiosity, the one that drove every one of my instincts, had already taken hold of me. 2 days later, I was driving along Nevada's desolate roads. The scorching heat made the air ripple in front of me, as if the desert itself were alive, consuming everything in its path. The GPS indicated I was just minutes away from the address in the email. With each mile, a growing sense of unease and vigilance tightened in my chest. What was I really expecting to find? A whistleblower, a revealing dossier, or something far more dangerous? When I arrived, the location was as barren as I'd imagined. A metal warehouse corroded by time, surrounded by an arid, empty landscape. I stepped out of the car, feeling the desert's fine sand sink beneath my feet, and approached the door where a yellowed envelope was pinned. My name was scrawled across it in hurried handwriting. Inside was an official-looking ID badge and a short message. Use this when you arrive. My heart raced. When I arrive, that meant the warehouse wasn't my final destination. I pocketed the badge and stepped inside. In the center of the empty hall, a metal table occupied the space. On it lay a lone folder, as solitary as it was mysterious. In the oppressive silence, a faint noise in the distance caught my attention. Almost imperceptible, it was the sound of something below me. The metal table began to shift, revealing a staircase leading to a narrow opening. An elevator. The cold sound of its gears echoed like an ancient whisper, belonging to a place that was never meant to be found. I sighed. Welcome to Base 73. The words slipped out, almost like a lament. The elevator descended slowly, each floor below ground level deepening the sensation that I was being drawn into the depths of something that defied reason. The lights flickered intermittently, and the hum of the motor was the only sound accompanying me on the way down. When the doors finally opened, I was met with a complex that seemed endless. Sterile corridors stretched before me, lined with metal and glass. The hum of machines and the faint clatter of keyboards filled the air, but the absence of any human presence was unsettling. I walked cautiously, the echo of my own footsteps following me, until I spotted a laboratory through a glass wall. In the center of the room was a massive tank, filled with a viscous greenish liquid. Inside it, a distorted silhouette floated. I stopped in front of the scene, my eyes locked on the figure in the tank. Something that might have once been human, but now was a grotesque mass of skin and scales. Its body was entwined with tubes, and its hands, now replaced by monstrous claws, trembled slightly in the fluid. The worst part, however, was its face. A mix of pain and despair, frozen in an agonizing expression. There was life in its eyes that suddenly opened, revealing two black empty sockets. They stared at me with an ancient hunger, a silent rage that seemed to emanate from every cell of that deformed body. I stepped back instinctively, panic taking hold of me. That thing shouldn't exist. I stumbled away, trying to erase the image of the creature from my memory. But with each door I passed through, the situation became more horrifying. Bodies, or what had once been human, were scattered in glass cages, connected to machines, deformed in impossible ways. Creatures that didn't belong to this world, products of experiments that had crossed every line of morality, silently screamed for a salvation that would never come. The corridor stretched on until I reached an imposing reinforced door, above which a plaque gleamed with cold engraved letters, Level 5, Maximum Containment Area. My instincts screamed for me to turn back, but curiosity pushed me forward. I hesitantly pushed the door open, and what I found on the other side, I was not prepared to face. The room was immense, dominated by several glass-reinforced cells, almost all of them empty, except for one. In the center of the main cell, a colossal creature was hunched over itself, as if bearing the weight of its own suffering. Its skin was translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with a greenish glow. A low, guttural sound escaped its lips, reverberating through the steel walls. When the creature turned, my heart nearly stopped. Its face, human but disfigured by deep scars, was framed by lifeless, vacant eyes. Grotesque arms stretched out in unnatural proportions, covered in a viscous substance that slowly dripped onto the floor. Its teeth, sharp as blades, reflected the room's dim light. But what disturbed me most was the look in its eyes, a mix of agony and cruel hunger, an insatiable craving for something that could never be satisfied. Before I could move, the deafening sound of alarms filled the room. Red lights began to flash frantically. The containment system was failing. I watched in horror as the creature rose and, with monstrous strength, shattered the glass cell as if it were made of paper. The beast let out a roar that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth, a sound that shook the entire base. My reaction was automatic. I turned and ran. I could feel the ground vibrating under the creature's heavy footsteps as it chased me through the corridors. Its claws scraped against the steel walls, and the sound of its labored breathing grew closer with each passing second. It was faster than it should have been, faster than I could have imagined for something that size. I ran through endless corridors, the panic inside me mounting. The monster was right behind me, and with each passing moment, I felt closer to my end. When I rounded a corner, I spotted a metal door and shoved it open with all my strength. I entered a dark, narrow hallway that led to the base's lower levels, a place that wasn't on the map. I quickly descended the stairs, every step taking me further from the creature, but not from danger. The entire base was steeped in the feeling of imminent death. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a rusty double door with a marked sign, Decommissioned Zone. The air was thick with the smell of rust, dust, and something chemical, as if the place had been forgotten for decades. I pushed the doors open, revealing a room that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Old equipment, dust-covered computers, and scattered papers told a story of abandonment and despair. That's when a name caught my attention on one of the folders, Project Prometheus. My heart raced again. Project Prometheus was a legend among conspiracy theorists. It was said to be one of the government's most secretive projects, involving genetic manipulations far beyond any ethical boundaries. The stories claimed it had been shut down after a series of incidents, but now, seeing the name here, I realized the truth was far darker. I picked up the folder carefully, as if holding a fragile piece of a long-lost puzzle. The title, Project Prometheus, was stamped in faded red letters, and I quickly skimmed through the pages. Among the scientific reports and incomprehensible graphs, there was something far more disturbing: details of secret biogenetic experiments, crossbreeding human DNA with natural predators, wolves, bears, sharks. But the most terrifying was the insertion of highly modified human genes in an attempt to create something stronger and smarter than any living creature. My eyes raced over the text as I tried to process what I was reading. It wasn't just about super soldiers. The government was creating a new species, something that transcended the boundaries of morality and biology. The pages detailed the early experiments and the creation of a creature called Alpha 73, described as the first successful attempt to combine DNA from multiple species, including human. But subsequent notes indicated that Alpha 73 was only the beginning of a much larger project. The annotations mentioned later generations, called betas, creatures designed to be even more powerful than the alphas. However, these experiments quickly spiraled out of control. The creatures were not only physically superior, but also exhibited aggressive and unpredictable behaviors. The betas began attacking their creators, Chaos engulfed the base, and what had once been a project to create perfect biological weapons turned into an uncontrollable nightmare. The final pages of the report spoke of an incident in 2018 when several betas escaped and massacred the security team. It was the beginning of the end for Base 73. The reports described a hurried evacuation, with the upper levels of the base being sealed to contain the creatures. But the worst abominations, the ones that weren't destroyed, were confined to Level 5, the same place I had just witnessed that monstrosity escape. Suddenly, a metallic click echoed through the room. I quickly closed the folder and looked around, panic already rising inside me. The sound was familiar. The elevator that had brought me here had been reactivated. I cautiously approached an observation window overlooking the main corridor and saw, with a chill down my spine, an armed team of soldiers marching through the underground complex. They weren't here just to contain the creatures. They were here to make sure no one got out alive, not even me. I quickly hid behind one of the large metal crates, trying to stifle the sound of my breathing. The soldiers were just a few feet away, and their footsteps echoed through the concrete, like the sound of a death sentence. A deep male voice echoed through the hallway. "We've checked Level 5. The creature escaped. We need to sweep every floor. Nothing can be left behind. If there are survivors, you know what to do," replied another voice, colder and more calculated, its tone revealing the deadly intent of their mission. I held my breath, my muscles tensing as the footsteps grew closer. These men were here to clean up the place, clean up everything. That included the secrets, the creatures, and anyone who knew about this underground hell. I was part of what needed to be eliminated. They passed me without noticing, and I waited a few seconds, listening to the sound of them moving away. When the corridor was silent again, I slowly stood up and looked around, searching for a way out. I had to be quick, my eyes fixed on a side corridor, narrow and poorly lit. It seemed to stretch away from the main areas of the base, and without thinking much, I slipped into it, trying to make as little noise as possible. The sound of the soldiers faded into the distance, but the terror still clung to me. I was trapped in an underground labyrinth with monsters and killers. The tunnel seemed endless, its walls unused and corroded by time. The walls were stained with rust, and the smell of burnt chemicals intensified with every step. My hands were sweating, and my breathing was fast. I had no idea where I was going, but I had to keep moving. Finally, the tunnel opened into a small surveillance room, filled with old monitors. Most of the screens were cracked, but a few still functioned. One of them displayed something that froze my blood. A restricted area of the base, much deeper than I had explored so far. And inside that section, there were more creatures. These beings weren't just the aberrations I had seen until then. They were much worse. On the screens, I saw grotesque bodies strapped to metal chairs, tied to life support machines, with limbs that grew and deformed in ways that defied comprehension. Other creatures swam in tanks of viscous fluid, their forms constantly shifting, as if they were in a perpetual state of mutation. The government wasn't just experimenting with human DNA. They were tampering with the laws of creation, trying to mold life according to their twisted desires. Project Prometheus had failed, not for lack of results, but because they had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Then, a noise behind me made me freeze. A metallic clank echoed through the tunnel, followed by a raspy groan. I quickly turned, my mind already expecting the worst. Maybe one of the monsters had escaped, or the soldiers had found me. But what I saw was something different. A human figure, hunched and trembling, emerged from the shadows. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice a mix of fear and urgency. The figure slowly advanced until the dim light of the surveillance room revealed a man in tatters. He wore what seemed to have once been a white lab coat, now dirty and torn, and his eyes were wide, marked by deep shadows. He looked like a ghost, a specter trapped in that underground hell. You shouldn't be here." His voice was weak, broken, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. He trembled, both from exhaustion and fear. "They won't let you leave alive." I approached cautiously. He wasn't a threat. On the contrary, he was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in this place. A survivor, perhaps the last of a project that had collapsed on everyone who dared to tamper with forces that should never have been touched. "And who are they?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "What the hell is happening here?" The man took a deep breath, his glassy eyes staring at the screens around us, as if afraid to speak the truth out loud. He stepped closer, stumbling over his own feet, as if the weight of guilt were crushing him. I was one of the scientists here." His voice faltered for a moment and he averted his gaze, as if confessing something unspeakable. "One of the few left, at least. Most are dead, killed when everything spiraled out of control. I managed to hide, but..." He paused and looked at the screens, his eyes filled with deep sadness. This should never have happened. Those words, spoken with such despair, echoed within me. The truth was right in front of me. He was one of the people responsible for everything I had seen. "Project Prometheus," I continued, my tone heavy with tension. "Was that what started all this?" The scientist looked at me with eyes full of regret. "Prometheus wasn't meant for this. It was supposed to be a revolution, a new era of evolution. The government wanted to create stronger, more adaptable beings, but the power we were trying to control was unstable. The creatures began to transform on their own, changing in ways we didn't foresee. But the government saw potential. More weapons, more control. That's when everything fell apart." He collapsed into a chair, exhaustion overtaking his fragile body. "And these things," I said, pointing to the screens, "are they the last of them, or are there more?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes dark. "What you've seen are just failed attempts, imperfect prototypes. In the depths of the base lie the final phases, the Omega phase. These creatures are the pinnacle of the project. They're not just strong, they have consciousness. They know what they are. They feel the hatred we injected into them." A deadly silence hung between us. The Omega phase. The mere mention made me shudder. The horror I had witnessed was just the beginning. The scientist lowered his head, as if awaiting the inevitable. "They're going to kill me, aren't they?" he asked, more to himself than to me, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I was part of this. I helped create this." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted the moment. The soldiers were returning. The scientist raised his eyes, and I knew there was no hope for him. He knew too much. "Come with me," I offered, extending my hand. "We can still get out." He shook his head slowly with a bitter smile. "There's no salvation for me. Go. If you reach the control room, you can overload the system. Seal the base. That will stop the creatures, or at least buy you time to escape. But you have to be quick. They can smell fear." I hesitated for a moment, but the despair in his eyes made my decision. He wasn't going anywhere. He had accepted the fate that awaited him. "Thank you," I murmured, as I ran through the narrow tunnel he had indicated. Every step was a race against death. The sound of the soldiers echoed in the distance, and the terror of being hunted pushed me forward. The tunnel seemed endless, but I finally reached the control room. The doors were slightly ajar, and inside, the monitors glowed faintly. The center of the room was dominated by a massive control panel, covered in buttons and levers. This was where I could seal the base's fate. My hands trembled as I approached the panel. On the screen, I saw a special cell. What was imprisoned inside was far worse than anything I had seen so far. Inside the cell, a monumental creature was chained, its disproportionate limbs covered in scars and open wounds. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, a cold, conscious light. It was the Omega phase, the culmination of all the terror. A panel blinked beside the monitor. The instruction was clear. Pressing the maximum containment protocol button would seal the entire base, burying everything and everyone inside. I had only seconds to decide. I pressed the button. The containment alarm sounded immediately, a sharp, relentless sound that reverberated throughout the base. Maximum containment protocol activated. The robotic voice repeated the message, emotionless, as red lights flashed intensely around me. The steel doors around the control room began to close with a metallic thud, like a death sentence being decreed. The soldiers, who had found me the moment I pressed the button, moved quickly. Their eyes widened for a brief second before the leader shouted orders with desperation in his voice. "Stop him! Disable the protocol!" But it was too late. The steel doors slid shut rapidly, locking the base with all of us inside. The dull thud echoed through the room, and panic gripped the team of soldiers as they futilely tried to open the doors. "We're all going to die here," one of them shouted, his face pale with terror. The leader, with a deep scar on his face, turned to me, hatred and frustration gleaming in his cold eyes. He knew I had sealed everyone's fate. "You have no idea what you've done," he shouted, advancing towards me with his gun raised. "You've just condemned the entire world." My mind was spinning, the deafening sound of the containment alarms and the soldiers' shouts leaving me dazed. Had I made the right decision, or had I just unleashed something far worse? The empty, conscious stare of the Omega phase was still burned into my mind. Suddenly, an explosion shook the base's structure, throwing us all to the ground. The lights flickered violently, and the robotic voice announced something that made my blood freeze. "Containment failed on level 5. Beta creature containment compromised." The screeching sound of steel being torn echoed through the corridors, and the sound of something very heavy walking grew closer. "We're dead," one of the soldiers whispered, his face twisted in terror. I looked around frantically. There was no way out. The button I had pressed sealed the entire base, but containment had failed on the lower levels. The creatures were loose. The soldier leader suddenly stood up, a deadly determination in his eyes. "You three, stay with me." He pointed at the remaining soldiers. "If we're going to die here, we're taking as many of those damn things with us as we can." They had no other choice. It was fight or be devoured by monsters that should never have existed. "And you," the leader said, pointing his gun at me, "you're coming with us. If you caused all this, then you're going to help us try to fix it, or at least survive a little longer. We're going to level 5. I hesitated. Every part of my body screamed to run in the opposite direction, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, and level 5, now completely exposed, was the heart of the horrors. If we stay here, we die. The leader gripped his gun tightly, his voice coming out through clenched teeth. "You have no choice." With my heart racing and fear taking root in every cell of my body, I silently nodded and joined the group. We were heading straight into hell, and the only comfort was that it would be quick. We walked in silence through the corridors, now shrouded in sinister shadows. The distant sound of escaping creatures grew louder, and I could hear the agonizing screams of something, or someone, being torn apart. The metal walls seemed to close in around us, as if the base was imprisoning us along with its secrets. The leader looked at me with a grim expression. "What exactly did you see on level 5? He asked as we marched. "We know about the mutations and the betas, but I heard rumors of something bigger." The words came out before I could control them, a reflex of everything I had witnessed. "The Omega phase." My voice was hoarse, almost inaudible. "It's something far worse. A monster. Intelligent. It knows what it is and feels anger. It's waiting to break free." The leader exchanged a quick glance with his men, the tension thickening in the air. "Then we have to stop it from getting out," he murmured, "at any cost." When we reached level 5, the destruction was evident. The cell that had once held the colossal creature was empty. The chains that had restrained it were shattered on the floor, as if torn apart by brute force. The environment was steeped in a sickly twilight, and the alarms blared incessantly, signaling that something immense had escaped. "My God," one of the soldiers murmured, staring at the emptiness where the monster had been. "That was Omega." Before the leader could respond, a deafening roar exploded from the corridor ahead of us. A guttural, bestial cry, but carrying an almost conscious intent. The floor trembled with the impact of the creature's footsteps, and we all froze for what seemed like an eternity. Then, it appeared. The creature was even larger than I remembered, and now, without the chains that had bound it, its body moved with terrifying agility. The Omega phase. Its eyes, glowing in the darkness, focused directly on us. There was hatred and intelligence in that gaze, a thirst for revenge. Its grotesque arms stretched out in absurd proportions, dripping the viscous substance I had seen before, as it slowly walked toward us like a predator toying with its prey. "Fire!" the leader shouted, pointing his gun at the creature. The soldiers opened fire, and the deafening sound of bullets echoed through the narrow corridor. But the Omega phase didn't stop. The bullets ricocheted off its grotesque skin, unable to pierce the dense flesh reinforced by something that defied logic. With a swift movement, the creature lunged, its enormous claws striking the soldiers with lethal precision. One of the men was thrown against the wall with such force that his body shattered on impact. Another was lifted into the air, caught in the Omega Phase's claws, and his scream of pain pierced the air before the sound of flesh being torn apart filled the space. I ran. My legs moved by instinct, and I knew that if I stayed, I'd be next. The leader was still firing uselessly at the creature, his expression of despair finally revealing that he knew this fight was lost. As I rounded the corner, I heard the sound of his body being slammed to the ground. It was over. My lungs burned as I ran through the base's endless corridors. The sound of the Omega Phase destroying everything in its path echoed in the distance. The base trembled, and the security system was collapsing. I didn't know where to go. I was lost in a crumbling underground labyrinth. Finally, I reached a staircase that seemed to lead to a higher level. Without hesitation, I began to climb, skipping 2 steps at a time, feeling the air grow warmer and thinner. I had to get out of there. The sound of the mutant creatures that had escaped from the lower levels mingled with the echo of destruction the Omega Phase was leaving behind. Every second, a new explosion, a new death. Then ahead, I saw a faint light, an exit. I ran with everything I had left in me, my heart pounding in my chest, as the sound of the base's collapse grew nearer and nearer. The light intensified as I approached, and finally I shoved open the last rusty door. The warm desert air hit me like a slap. I was out. I fell to my knees in the sand, my body trembling all over. I had survived. The Nevada desert sky was tinged orange by the setting sun, but as I breathed in the dry, warm air, a cold truth settled within me. Base 73 was destroyed, but something had escaped. I turned to look at the entrance to the base, now in ruins, and knew that even buried under tons of sand and concrete, the monsters we had created would never remain trapped forever, and with that, the desert's silence enveloped me. The desert's silence mingled with the distant noise of the Base 73 wreckage collapsing behind me. I had survived, but the weight of what had happened still pressed on my chest, crushing any sense of relief I might have felt. I looked toward the horizon. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, as if the very desert were marked by the blood of the abominations buried beneath its surface. But something remained. Something had escaped. Whatever had happened down there, the Omega Phase, and all the creatures the government had created, were no longer confined to that place alone. I didn't know what, or who, had really made it out alive, but I was certain of one thing. What I witnessed in Base 73 was only the beginning. I walked slowly to the car, my legs heavy with exhaustion, my body still trembling from the fear that seemed to have settled in my gut. I opened the door and sat behind the wheel, not sure where I was going. The government would bury the incident, cover the tracks, erase every trace of the truth, but I had seen firsthand what they had created, and I knew that sooner or later it would resurface. Whether in another secret base, another experiment, or in nature itself, these creatures, or something worse, would return. I turned the key and the rental car's engine purred softly, a relief to hear something so mundane after all the chaos I had been through. Before leaving, I grabbed my laptop from the passenger seat and powered it on. The story needed to be told, even if no one would believe it. I opened a new document and began to type. Base 73, a secret buried, but not dead. As the words flowed, the truth took shape. I knew the forces behind all this would come after me. They always do. But the story was alive, and now it was my only defense. It needed to be revealed. It needed to be heard. I took one last look at the horizon as the sun finally disappeared completely, plunging the desert into deep darkness. I started the car and began driving, the road ahead stretching into the unknown. The only certainty I had was that once the monsters were unleashed, they could never be controlled again. As the car's headlights cut through the desert's darkness, I knew that somewhere those creatures were still out there, waiting, and one day they would return. But this time, would the world be ready? I doubted it.